So for our final session of Metaphysics and Philosophy of Origins, I'm going to go back to our Darwin series where we started with that Eugenie Scott video, and she talked about what science was, how the scientific method works, the difference between inference and the scientific method. And there was another lecture from the same Darwin seminar held at Stanford. And in this case, they brought in a social anthropologist, and she's going to talk about social Darwinism. And I thought it was quite a brave move, but I think it's really important for you to be aware of and know about. And so like I did with the Eugenie Scott video, I'm going to play this for you, and then I'll make pauses and observations as we go. All right, so.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Carol, and thank you to Bill and to the committee for inviting me to be here. It's certainly an honor to be among such illustrious company as the others you've had speaking to you. Let me get this. Yes. Now, we're all Darwin fans here, so part of what I'm going to do tonight is to try and help us think a little bit about why Darwin isn't more widely accepted in the social sciences today. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that at the beginning, and then I'm going to shift into talk about some of the evolutionary oriented work that is being done. So, excuse me, anthropology is a disparate field, the traditional four-field approach. I'm going to be focusing on sociocultural anthropology and thinking about the responses of sociocultural anthropologists and sociologists who share the closest kinship intellectually of these different schools. And in particular, what I want to start with is thinking about the cult of Darwin and the way that Darwin is viewed. One of the things that I tell students when reading Darwin is that if you come from a sociological tradition, from a sociocultural anthropology tradition, any Darwin at all, what you probably read is The Descent of Man. And that's it. If you are a biology student, by contrast, or a physical anthropology student, if you read any Darwin at all in the course of your early studies, you probably read an edition of The Origin of Species, and that's it. And so that difference in what people read is tremendously important, as I'm going to think about here, because you get very different ideas of who Darwin was and what his methods were, how good a scientist he was, and how he related to other people, and how he thought about data relating to human beings, depending on which of those that you read. In The Origin of Species, which is the first edition, which is often held up as a hallmark of the scientific method, he goes to great lengths of presenting detailed evidence of data he's collected himself in all kinds of different situations. This is just one of many of the experimental type of data that Darwin collected. In this particular case, he was talking about how he was looking at enclosures on heath, and how enclosing something led to the development or to the growth of all of these different plants that were attempting to grow all this time, but when it was unenclosed, cows would come and chew them down. And he at one point, he talks about here, he actually stops and counts, right? He gives us quantitative data. In 1 square yard at a point some 100 yards distant from one of the old clumps, meaning one of the old ancient clumps of trees, 32 little trees, and one of them, judging from the rings of growth, had during 26 years tried to raise its head above the stems of the heath and had failed. No wonder that as soon as the land was enclosed, it became thickly clothed with vigorously growing young firs. So he's made a statement about the way in which environmental pressure, the feeding of the cows, has affected what grows on the heath, and the fact that there are no trees except in these enclosure areas. And then he gives us quantitative data that he's collected himself empirically to support this. Great science.
Yes, done through observation and experimentation.
By contrast, in The Descent of Man, which is the thing that most sociological students would take a look at, he has a very different approach. This is from the chapter in which he's discussing race, in which he's thinking about the extinction of different groups of human beings, and in which he's considering the ways in which extinctions are caused, and how change in the environment impacts human beings. And he notes, just before he comes to this passage, he's talking about Tasmania when it was first colonized, when it was first colonized by Europeans, and that there were initial estimates that there were between 7,000 or 20,000 native Tasmanians. And then Darwin writes, their number was soon greatly reduced, chiefly by fighting with the English and with each other. After the famous hunt by all the colonists, when the remaining natives delivered themselves up to the government, they consisted only of 120 individuals who were in 1832 transported to Flinders Island, 40 miles long and from 12 to 18 miles broad. It seems healthy, and the natives were well treated. Nevertheless, they suffered greatly in health. Darwin goes on to wonder about the reasons for the extinction of the Tasmanians. He does give us some numbers about the numbers of men, women, and children in different years. As you can see, it goes dramatically down, 111, 100. By 1847, there's only 46, and by 1864, there's only 4 individuals left. But Darwin's assessment, even though he mentions that there are some other scholars who think that their death followed attempts to civilize them, quote unquote, or that it was the change of living and food and primarily their banishment that caused this extinction, Darwin's assessment is that many of the wilder races of man are apt to suffer much in health when subjected to changed conditions or habits of life. Mere alterations in habits, which do not appear injurious in themselves, seem to have the same effect. These are passages that when sociological students read them are appalling. The way in which that Darwin doesn't seem to recognize the impact that a hunt of human beings by other human beings would have on the survivors.
Okay. So the broad strokes here that Melissa's making is, in the social sciences, you're probably going to be reading Descent of Man. And Descent of Man is full, like she said, of 19th century white, male, Victorian, patriarchal biases. And these not only include misogyny, but also very racist ideas about other human beings on the planet. Whereas she says, if you look at Origin of Species, which the full title is Origin of Species and the Preservation of Preferred Races, races there, Darwin is using more as species in Origin of Species, and he's rolling out his idea of natural selection, which comes through mutation, adaptation to environments. And so this isn't like a conscious personification of Mother Gaia thinking about how she's going to make all these other creatures. Simply, in different environments, different animals, even of the same species, are going to have a greater or lesser extent to survive. The ones that survive, whatever features or traits, physiological traits, were allowing them to survive, is then passed on to their offspring. And so you get a genetic drift that aligns with environments. In Descent of Man, however, Darwin is talking more about social Darwinism, and these ideas of different races are more advanced or evolved. And I wish I had my whiteboard. I tried to look on the internet and I couldn't find any any good hierarchy charts. But if I was drawing this out for you, basically we would start at the top with, and this goes back, let me pull up another image for you real quickly. Actually, I don't want to lose this video, so I'm not going to do that quite yet, but we'll talk about it later. I was going to pull up the great chain of being for you. But if you think about, remember how we go from pure being all the way down to non-being, and humans are kind of at this halfway point? Well, if you're a naturalist materialist, there is only physical humanity and then the animals and plants and minerals that come below man. There are no souls, spirits, gods, or God. And so if you get rid of the top half of the great chain of being, you're left with man sitting at top. But like I mentioned, you can make subcategories. So in that piece of that hierarchy or ladder of the great chain of being that represents humanity, on the top, surprise, surprise, we would have Aryan, Nordic, Europeans. Okay. Whiter than white. And then below them, we would have like the Celts. Those are like the Irish, the Scots, the Britons. Below them, we would have, so the Germanic, Nordic people on top, the Celts, the Slavs. Then we would get into people from the Middle East region, all the way down to Jews and Arabs. And even Indians from the subcontinent of India would be considered in that top category. And Darwin called this, or the social Darwinists called this, Caucasoids. So in the Caucasoid piece of that thing, you have white Western European males all the way down to subcontinent Indians. And then in the next category would be the Mongoloid. And depending on which country you're coming from, if you're from China, you probably see the Chinese as the most evolved or advanced. If you're Japanese, you probably see yourself on top, but it would be the same sort of hierarchy. Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Malaysian, Polynesian, and on down. And then finally, the last rung would be called the Negroid. And so Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid. And then, interestingly enough, those ethnic groups that fall in the Negroid category, ones that appear more Western in their features, perhaps a thinner nose, thinner lips, high cheekbones, body types, they would be seen as more evolved, where the ones that were darker, swarthier, broader nose, thicker lips would be seen less evolved. And then below the Negroid, we would have Aborigines, and this would include like Native Americans, Australian, Aborigines, etc. And in their case, it's not even sure whether they're actually even human or not yet, or if they're still animals or somewhere in between. Now, I noticed when she talked about that hunt in Tasmania, that hunt was pre-origin of species. So I don't know that you can necessarily blame social Darwinism for that great hunt, because it happened in 1834. He published Origin of Species in 1859, and then I think that Descent of Man quote was from 1874. But in 1874, as he's talking about this hunt, you see the social Darwinist features, just making assumptions that, well, maybe if the Aborigines were more advanced humans, they wouldn't have died off when they were relocated. But because they were a more wild, more primitive type of human, they didn't make it. Not seeing any problem with hunting them, taking away their property, any of that. And I really appreciate this professor bringing this up. I mean, she teaches at Stanford, but if you've noticed how quiet the audience has gotten, because she's sharing some really unpleasant stuff about who this whole conference is about. But I think it's very important, and I actually think she's quite fair. And I'm going to be fair at the end and kind of point out how theism was doing, and pantheism does the same thing, but from a more religious, spiritual perspective. They still have hierarchies, they still oppress, there's still greed, but it's justified in the name of God or the gods or the caste system rather than in social Darwinism and evolution. All right, I'm going to get back to Melissa. Any questions before I start back up the video? Okay. Yes, Vanessa, she is going to have the great chain of being.
That he seems to gloss over the ways in which he says they don't appear injurious in themselves. These raise hackles among sociological students who read them. Darwin goes on to think about this in terms of what the qualities of different racial groups are more broadly, and he says that it has often been said that man can resist with impunity the greatest diversities of climate and other changes, but this is true only of the civilized races. Man in his wild condition seems to be in this respect almost as susceptible as his nearest allies, the anthropoid apes, which have never yet survived long when removed from their native country. So
now, I can't remember if I brought this up in our class, but when we talked about, if we talked about unilineal evolution, this was this idea by early European anthropologists that all human beings pass through different stages of development. And so we would go from animals to savages to barbarians to being civilized. What marks civilization is reading and writing, is having a written word. This is also what marks civilization. When we talk about a prehistoric society, at least academically, we're talking about cultures or societies that do not have written communication. So by definition, you could have prehistoric societies living today if they did not have reading and writing. I just wanted to point that out.
Darwin, who in the first edition of Origin is uses such brilliant logic and uses such reliable data. Here, even there appear to be logic problems. He doesn't think about if it's only quote unquote civilized races, by which he generally means Europeans, who are the ones who can move out of the area in which they are accustomed to, then how did we get the peopling of the world before there were European civilizations? How did the Inuit and their ancestors adapt to the Arctic? And it also doesn't take into consideration the parts of the world that European colonizers were decimated by diseases when they colonized in parts of Africa, parts of Asia, and elsewhere.
Whoops, hit the wrong switch, but I'll fix that. I just wanted to give a shout out to the movie called Guns, Germs, and Soul. It's a book that was written and they made a documentary of it, and I do have it under cultural anthropology if you want to see that. Did you want to say something, Justin?
I can't. It won't let me turn my mic off, Mr. Blackburn.
See if I can turn it off for you. I have the power.
I'll try logging off and back in.
All right.
It's true only of the civilized race. Man in his wild condition seems to be in this respect almost as susceptible as his nearest allies, the anthropoid apes, which have never yet survived long when removed from their native country. So Darwin, who in the first edition of Origin is uses such brilliant logic and uses such reliable data. Here, even there appear to be logic problems. He doesn't think about if it's only quote unquote civilized races, by which he generally means Europeans, who are the ones who can move out of the area in which they are accustomed to, then how did we get the peopling of the world before there were European civilizations? How did the Inuit and their ancestors adapt to the Arctic? And it also doesn't take into consideration the parts of the world that European colonizers were decimated by diseases when they colonized in parts of Africa, parts of Asia, and elsewhere.
The tropics. Europeans didn't do so hot in the tropics.
So these this difference in the parts of Darwin that one reads leaves people with very different impressions of him, either as a brilliant scientist or as a Victorian gentleman who showed the racism of his time and place. Now, the challenge for us is that, of course, Darwin was both. And in trying to put back together again, excuse me, in trying to put back together again an understanding of him, we have to see him with the full picture. Now, within evolutionary perspectives, people are going back to Darwin's Descent of Man book, in which he also discusses the concept of sexual selection, and are saying, yes, people who are evolutionists, who are evolutionary biologists, are saying, we need to rethink the way in which Darwin has presented some of these ideas and to rethink what sexual selection in particular is. This is just one example. This is a very prominent example. Joan Roughgarden, who is a very prominent evolutionary biologist here at Stanford, has recently published a book, Evolution's Rainbow, and she has another one coming out soon called The Genial Gene, in which she's taking on this Darwinian notion of sexual selection and saying, Darwin's presentation and formulation that what females are really doing is searching for the best male, and that you get, as a result, sort of aggressive, philandering males and coy females, is really kind of naive. And that if you look across the range of species, in Roughgarden's Evolution's Rainbow book, I think she's got about 300 different species that she gives examples from, that it's more complicated than that. That very simple kind of model doesn't seem to fit well the empirical data that we have now. Now, that doesn't mean she's throwing out Darwin. It doesn't mean she's saying that that Darwinian theory and that evolutionary theory is wrong. She's just saying we need to look more carefully at the data and rethink parts of these, arguing that we should be looking at cooperation rather than competition. So how did this happen? How did Darwin go from writing such a brilliant scientific treatise in the first edition of Origin to something that was more understandably a product of his time and place in the Descent?
And to be fair, remember, we are all products of our time,
influenced by his
to a
peers.
degree.
And Herbert Spencer, one of the early sociologists, Lubbock and others, McClellan, Maine, Morgan, there's a number of evolutionary thinkers who could be mentioned. And as I'll talk about in just a moment, these were people who thought of evolution somewhat differently than Darwin did. In particular, Spencer was the one who came up with the concept of survival of the fittest. This was something that was not in Darwin's first edition of Origin.
Okay, real quickly before she goes on with the survival of the fittest, does anyone know what a tautology is? Tautology. This is one of my favorite tautologies of all time. A tautology is a statement or phrase that is simply repeating like a definition. It's not giving you any new information. Like, it's kind of like a circle. And so let me show you how it works. If we roll out the phrase survival of the fittest and we ask, well, who are the fittest? The answer, of course, is those who survive. And then we ask, well, why did they survive? It's because they're the fittest. All you're doing is making survivability and fitness equal to each other. You're making them synonyms. It's not telling you anything about what makes them fittest besides that they survived, or why they survived besides they're fit. So it's a clever little phrase. It just doesn't really tell you much.
Origin of Species. It didn't appear until the second edition, and it shifted the way it exists in the discussion about the concept of natural selection to only talk as survival. It really is somewhat akin to the person who probably most that Spencer forward Charles Dickens' novel, where which and this is a classic movie with Alistair Sims playing Ebenezer Scrooge. This is Herbert Spencer up here. The classic line where two gentlemen from a charity come and request Scrooge to make a donation, and he says, well, let them go to the poorhouse. And they say, well, most people would rather die than go to the poorhouse. And he says, well, let them die then and decrease the surplus population.
Sound familiar right now, people?
That kind of attitude that was associated with this concept of survival of the fittest that Spencer and others had promoted before Darwin published Origin of Species in the first place. And that idea comes out of the larger notion of evolution at the time, this concept of evolution as a potential, of an unfolding of a predestined outcome.
There's the great chain of being on the right.
It goes back to centuries of thought, really. If you go back to the Scala Natura, which is pictured over here, that there's this scale, the natural scale, from the lowly critters all the way up through various forms of animals.
I want to give you guys a blow up of that one. Okay, let me just share this image real quick with you. There we go. Okay, so this is what I was talking about earlier, if you remember, where we have the great chain of being. And we got God on top up here, and then they don't have the demiurge in this one, but we have the angels, spirits, then we have humans, mankind, then animals, all the way down plants, all the way down to minerals. And so we have this hierarchy. And basically what the social Darwinists are doing is they're simply just adding rungs in this section here of the human section, with the white Western Europeans, Aryan, Nordics, Germanic people on top, Celts, Slavs, all the way down until we get to then the Mongoloid groups and the Negroid groups. And if you think, wow, I can't believe people actually thought like this. Well, in my own lifetime, I'll leave the school's name out of it, but I went to a very conservative school on the East Coast. And when I enrolled into this school, I had to declare, they gave me 3 choices of race. I could declare Caucasoid, Mongoloid, or Negroid, which is fascinating to me because these are social Darwinist terms. And this was a very conservative fundamentalist college. Anyways, you were only allowed to date within your group. So if you declared Caucasoid, I could only date Caucasians. If I declared Mongoloid, I could only date Asians. If I declared Negroid, I could only date Africans or people whose origins came from Africa. Fascinating. If you were from mixed race, you had to declare which race you wanted to claim, and you could only date within that race. Seeing as this was a college of maybe 5,000 to 7,000 people, and there were only like 5 Africans there were maybe 2 African Americans and 5 people from Africa, and the rest were predominantly in the Caucasoid camp. And I just thought it was so interesting that even the school that believed in a literal Genesis account, a young age of the earth, they still had bought into this what I think is quite clearly racism. That I believe there is one human race by definition, if we're looking at race like species, because any ethnic group that is a human being can interbreed and successively produce viable offspring, which means we're all part of the same species. When we start to talk about race being determined by the melanin in your skin or your body type or eye color, I mean, how superficial can you get? I mean, we are all part of the same race or species. And so this will keep coming up, but I'm going to go back to the video. It's going to get freakier.
And humanity to the angels and finally to God. And that with this scaling, each level, of course, was presumed to be better than the scale below it. And each scale was presumed to be unfolding what was inherent in it, what its potential was. So you get this sense of stages of development, and there were other scholars approximately around this time, both before and shortly after Darwin, who were writing about these stages in terms of human societies. Sir Henry Maine had done some of this. Perhaps more famous is Lewis Henry Morgan in the United States, who talked about stages of civilization, from savage, lower, middle, and upper savagery to barbarism, and at last to civilization. And Morgan linked each of these to what was going on in terms of the technology. Oh, you've got a bow and arrow, that's upper savagery. You've got pottery, that's lower barbarism. Domestication, well, that's middle barbarism. I mean, he had specific stages, and the presumption was that human beings and human societies moved through these stages and progressed up this natural scale and went on. Now, some of the more...
That last thing she said, that's a much more benevolent view of social Darwinism. So you still have the divisions, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, and the Aboriginal down here that are kind of like the in-between. But some people thought just because we're more advanced or evolved than other humanoid type species doesn't mean we should be cruel to them. And so a lot of Europeans, including Christian Europeans, had this attitude of the white man's burden, if you've ever heard that figure of speech, or the great white father. And it was this idea that since the Western white Europeans are the most advanced and evolved, we're like the adult races. And then the Mongoloid or the Asiatic races are the adolescent races. And then way down at the bottom would be the Negroid, or the African races, or the Aboriginal races would be like children. And so just like in human society, the adults need to give guidance to the adolescents, and children need to be cared for. And so you got this, like, I mean, compared to imperialism, I guess paternalism is nice, where it's like a benevolent overseer, but it's still this idea, this hierarchical idea, that because of these superficial melanin and eye color and all these other sorts of surfacey distinctions were used to actually categorize the worth and value, or at least the advancement of different ethnicities of human beings. What I was saying earlier about that school, since there were only like 2 African Americans and maybe 5 Africans, if you were mixed race, you might want to ask if you could make your designation a few weeks in, so just in case you met someone that interested you on the race you didn't pick. Anyways, enough of that nonsense.
Liberal thinkers of this time, like E.B. Tyler, had a concept of psychic unity, where they thought that human beings, even if they were at different stages, all had the same cognitive capacity. They just hadn't gone as far in the unfolding of their destiny. That was rather a liberal view at the time. There were other scholars who had a very different view and had a decidedly more, what, as we'll see, became a sinister view,
yes,
that people at different scales, quote unquote lower scales, were actually lower in cognitive ability. And this is where some of the reaction that we still see today comes from the links that are presumed between Darwin and eugenics. Eugenics was founded by Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, with an 1869 book called Hereditary Genius. It was extremely popular among people who were highly prominent and well respected in their day. Sir Winston Churchill, for example, actually proposed laws in Britain based on the eugenics writing of Galton.
Yep.
And it was only stopped in Britain because G.K. Chesterton managed to through to get the power in the Parliament.
Thank you, Chesterton.
In the U.S., by contrast, those laws passed. Charles Davenport.
But you didn't read about
was,
that in your
the
U.S.
head
history.
Of the Eugenics Record Office that was funded by the Carnegie Institute. There are Stanford ties to eugenics. Lewis Terman, who's the inventor of the Stanford Binet IQ test. Those IQ tests were part of the eugenics movement. David Starr Jordan, the former president of Stanford, was on the chair of the Committee of Eugenics.
Do you hear how quiet the room is right now? I'm just getting so much joy out of this woman, and she's obviously a scholar, knows her history, and I just think it is absolutely wonderful. Now, this isn't making her not believe in evolution or perhaps even a naturalistic materialist worldview. I don't know what her personal worldview is, but I appreciate how she can still see values in some of the ideas of Darwin, but she is bold about calling out these people that incorporated it for their own racist, imperialistic, sexist agenda. And I'm just really, really pleased. And what was so eye-opening for me, I was a history major, and I had never heard this stuff about the eugenics, especially as it relates to California. So you're definitely going to want to pay attention to this next one. I mean, we hear all about Nazi Germany, right? And all the horrible experiments and testing and things that the Nazis did. But a lot of the model for what the Nazis were doing, minus the extermination camps, was California. California had been practicing eugenics long before. And like she just pointed out, you've probably heard in the past, if you're aware at all, that people have claimed IQ tests are racist. Well, you bet they're racist. And the Stanford Binet IQ test was actually used to determine who should be allowed to breed and who should not. So think about that, folks, for a little bit. Any comments before we get into eugenics? Questions, comments, observations? Okay, moving on.
For the American Breeders Association.
There you go.
William Sumner, who was the founder of the American Sociological Society, which later became the American Sociological Association, was also part of this. Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood,
what a surprise,
was also part of this. So you can see from Galton and Churchill and Jordan, Sanger over here, and Davenport, people who were highly prominent people were part of this movement. And the point of the eugenics movement was to promote the fitness of the population. And in fact, specifically to see that the unfit were sterilized so they would not contribute to it, and to promote births by those considered fit. Now, drawing on Spencer, those who were fit, of course, was highly linked to race and to economic class. And training that was...
This was just so shocking to me. I had no idea we were doing eugenics in America. I don't know what. I guess it's just something we don't like to talk about. And so this idea, the intentionality is good, right? And if you are a naturalist materialist and you only believe humans are their physical vehicles, well, of course you would want well-functioning, intelligent vehicles to be producing other well-functioning, intelligent vehicles. You don't want the diseased, the lamed, the mentally limited, the feeble to be making babies, because it's just going to be a drain on society. And I know that sounds callous and heartless, but if you're just looking at it through this pure empirical rational lens, eugenics makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, for the good and well-being of society at large. And if you think, wow, I can't believe people were doing this 100 years ago or so, folks, this is happening in California in my lifetime. When I was a young man, I was probably 13, 14 years old. I had a developmentally disabled friend. He was probably in his mid-20s. He was living with a very godly Christian family I knew. And I ran into him one day after he had come back from a doctor appointment. And I said, how are you doing? And he said, they cut off my balls. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, they cut off my balls. And I thought, he was maybe confused. He had like the mind of maybe like a 4-year-old, really nice guy, but not super bright or coordinated. And I thought maybe it was just a checkup and he checking for a hernia or something, and he got confused. So I asked the family he lived with, and as casually as we were talking about the weather, they said, oh yeah, it's very common because they don't want developmentally disabled people and babies. Even as a young 13, 14-year-old, I knew something was horrifically wrong. And yeah, I get the pragmatic piece. How is this guy? He has the body of a man, but the mind of a child. And the same with young women in his condition. They have fully developed female bodies that could bear children, but they are like little children themselves. And how are they going to care for offspring? And so often people that are in the system are given birth control or things like that. But this sterilization, removing someone's testes or ovaries, that's pretty permanent, and it seems like a violation at like the most basic level. But it has to do with this value, with this and that was in like the 70s here in California. So onward.
For a social work was founded in order to identify the mentally degenerate, quote unquote. Some of the training for this took 15 minutes. And then they were sent out to make judgments that would affect people's lives. The initial targets in the early part of the 20th century were for Jews and Irish and Italians, who in the early 20th century weren't considered white. Later in the century, they targeted Spanish-speaking peoples, African Americans, Native American.
This is a fascinating study to me. It's kind of like, what does it mean to be white in America? And who was white at the beginning and who wasn't? And who's white now? And I have some really strong speculations on who the next white Americans are going to be. And it's just so interesting because it doesn't have to do with pigment of the skin. It has to do with some other sort of abstract mentality. Like she just gave the example. Early on in the 19th century, Jews and the Irish weren't considered white because, see, even in that hierarchy, even though they both were in that big Caucasoid piece, they weren't in the Aryan Nordic piece because the Irish are Celts and the Jews are Semites or Semitic. And so they're not seen as fully white. But then over time, as different immigrants came in, the Jews and the Irish became assimilated or became white, and then the Italians weren't white, or the Eastern Europeans weren't white. And then they became assimilated. And I think the next movement we see, of course, is with Hispanics or Latin Americans. As they integrate more and more into American society, they are taking on kind of that white American. And in fact, in the past, those were your choices, right? On censuses, you could be either Caucasoid or Negroid. There wasn't even this concept of Hispanic, or I think right now, my box, the closest one to my ethnicity is non-white Hispanic, which I think is really funny. I always usually check the other box and either write in human or Celt, depending on my mood. All right, let's continue.
In the 1920s, the American Eugenics societies went to state fairs. They put on exhibits like this that talked about some people are born to be a burden on the rest. Each of these lights is supposed to flash every so many seconds, and to point out people who are, let's see, on the left here, there are those who are going to never be above the mental capability of an 8-year-old child. Then they go through various degrees of this, and on the right, where you only flash every 7 minutes, so a lot less frequently, is someone who's really going to be a good person. So they want people to learn about this so that they can correct it. And they did a number of things to bring this to people. They had better baby contests down. These are better baby contests. That was in 1924. The Fitter Family Contests. This was a family that was considered, you see over here, it says Governor's Trophy, Fittest Family. This one, I think, was from this was from Kansas, 1920. And then there's another one from Texas where there you can see a smaller version of the light up sign indicating to people what's going on. And even cartoons, you must have a eugenics certificate. This had real impacts on medical research. For example, Dr. Joseph Goldberger found as early as 1915 that the disease pellagra, and this is an example of what can happen with the disease pellagra, is really not something, it's not something that needs to happen. It's a nutrition deficiency. With niacin treatments, as this girl got, you can have complete recovery. But in 1915, when Goldberger presented evidence that pellagra was a nutritionary deficiency, he got voted down at the meeting at which he presented this, and eugenicists argued that really pellagra was the result of the bad genes of the poor and evidence that such people ought to be sterilized.
Holy cow.
The U.S. passed a number of laws requiring compulsory sterilization of people deemed unfit. Carrie Buck, who is pictured, the younger woman pictured here, fought this compulsory order for herself all the way to the Supreme Court in 1927. People had decided that her mother had a mental age of 8, supposedly, from one of these IQ tests. Her 7-month-old daughter was deemed not quite normal, and they were institutionalized. This photo is from the Virginia Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded from 1924. The Supreme Court in 1927, Oliver Wendell Holmes penned the decision, and he said that he has a long description of which he's saying, we need to take into account the good of society, and we have to take all this very seriously. And at the end, he concludes with 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Carrie Buck lost and was forcibly sterilized.
Shoo.
What a lot of people don't know is that the sterilization laws in the U.S. by World War II, 30 of the 48 U.S. states had such compulsory sterilization laws. In the United States, by 1968, about 65,000 people were compulsorily sterilized. And in 1992, there were 22 of the states still had these
1992, people.
Now, between 2002 and 2007, 5 different states have apologized, including California.
Yes, California.
Gray Davis did that when he was governor. But the Nazi laws, eugenics laws, that more people are a little bit more familiar with, were based on the U.S. laws. And indeed, they especially looked at the laws and the way they were implemented in California, because California was responsible for about 1/3 of the total number of sterilizations. And the Nazis looked most closely at California because they saw this as evidence that they could implement sterilization at a mass level. And so in the German poster down here, this was a Nazi-era poster promoting sterilization, and the flags that are all on there, what it says is "we're not alone," and the flags are the flags of all the countries in the world that had compulsory sterilization laws on the books at the time. This leads to the kind of photo, I didn't Photoshop that image, I found it on the web, of Darwin and Hitler. And this is a position that a lot of people, not just creationists, but also humanists within academics take, that they think that these kinds of outcomes of eugenics are a direct result of Darwin, and it strongly colors their opinion of him. These kinds of sterilization laws still go on in the present. Between 1990 and 2000 in Peru, Alberto Fujimori pressured sterilization of over 200,000 rural people in Peru. So these are issues that are still faced today. In anthropology particularly, American anthropology was founded virtually against evolutionary thinking. Franz Boas, who is considered the founder of American anthropology, and one of his very prominent students, Margaret Mead, were both highly involved in the public and in research to disprove the kinds of positions that eugenicists took.
Okay, I'm going to pull up another image here. If you want to watch the rest of it, you can find that on my YouTube channel. I believe that's Darwin's Legacy, and I believe it's number 7 in the series if you're looking for that. And I can post the full link up later too. Before I ramble on about this more, curious if anyone would like to say anything or ask me any questions.
Have you seen the movie Sam?
What's it called?
Sam.
No.
It's about like a mentally challenged man, and he had like a baby with a prostitute, and then like he raises. Vanessa, have you seen it?
Yeah, it's a good movie.
It's a really good movie, but like he raises the child till like her mental capacity passes his, and then she's like taken away.
Oh no.
Yeah, I actually haven't seen the whole thing. Vanessa, do you want to share more?
Yeah, it's actually pretty good, and it kind of shows he was disabled. He had the capacity to actually love his daughter.
Okay, you're kind of breaking up, Vanessa. And once again, I get this idea of how with certain people, especially the developmentally disabled, that perhaps are children themselves, can't care for themselves, that how are they going to care for others or deal with the complexities of human sexuality or relationships or marriages. And I want to be gracious there. And I'm not trying to advocate for a clear-cut thing, but this idea of how we determine the worth or value of people, what do we consider advanced or evolved? Who do we consider less than or other? And does that give us a reason? Like, part of the justification of imperialism was, look, if these other races were as advanced and developed as the European races, we wouldn't be able to come in and exploit them, enslave them, take their resources and sell it back to them. And if they evolve past us, then we will be in the same relationship to them. But for right now, we are more evolved and we don't need to feel bad, just like a lion doesn't need to feel bad about taking its prey. It's eat or be eaten, survival of the fittest. And you can see how that, hopefully you can see how that plays into capitalism, which especially the modern iterations that came also with the Industrial Revolution and in the 19th century. And it's basically, it's social Darwinism applied to economies, with basically this idea of if you have competing companies or products, the most fit is the one that is going to survive, and the competition will go extinct. And that's what we would call like a laissez-faire economics, survival of the fittest. The best ideas or companies will rise to the top, and the inferior ones will not survive, or they'll have to adapt into some other niche. The image I have up below is from a book by Stephen Gould called The Mismeasure of Man. And he was a paleontologist, also a Darwinian evolutionist, but he was having great conflict with the geneticist and other Darwinian theorists. And they kept saying, come on, paleontologists, we need these missing links. We need to show the bridge between these early hominid or proto-human species and modern man. And as I alluded to briefly when we covered man, there are no strict transitional forms. What we see are intact species, whether we're talking about afarensis, habilis, erectus, Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon. Often these species will overlap, and some turned out, like Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon, perhaps we're not two different species at all, especially if we have DNA, Neanderthal DNA in us. And I think I shared many Europeans have up to 4% Neanderthal DNA, which would tell me we're not separate species. Anyways, Stephen Gould came up with others with this idea of punctuated equilibrium. And once again, I wish I had my whiteboard, but I'll do it with my hand. So if you can imagine, you have this slow and gradual plane from simple to complex. And normally it has this like stasis where things just kind of stay the same. There's an equilibrium. But due to environmental or mutational aspects, you could have rapid change in a short period of time, and then it would achieve stasis or equilibrium again. Then rapid change, long periods of time, rapid change. So evolution begins to look more like a stairway rather than a slope or a handicap access ramp, where you go through stops and starts of evolution. Now, remember, with an evolutionary timeline, a short period of time could be a couple million years, if you're talking billions of years, right? So that shortness becomes relative. But I really do appreciate Stephen Gould because he wanted to point out a lot of the racism and misogyny that was happening in early evolutionary research. And he said, not only is it bad science, but it needs to be confronted and challenged. And a lot of the observations, I'll just make an obvious one right here. This is from his book, and these were typical illustrations in science textbooks showing the different skull shapes and then a caricatured image next to it. And if you notice, they have an African-looking gentleman there whose skull looks right in between a orangutan or chimpanzee and a modern classical Greco-Roman white human, right? And Gould is just saying, first of all, these are like drawings made up, hyperbolic drawings to make a point. And if you simply want to talk about who's more evolved, I mean, what kind of lips do the great apes have, or chimpanzees? They're not thick, broad lips like we see among many African-American people groups. They're very thin, like you would expect to find in more Caucasoid or Mongoloid people groups. And so a fuller lip or nostril would be seen as an advancement, not as something closer to the apes. And so he's really good about this, and I appreciate that. And I want to make this clear, too, because I don't want to let theists or pantheists off the hook, because they were doing the same thing, maybe not justifying it through science or through Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest, but we already talked about the caste system. If you're in a lower caste, not only do we not have to show compassion to those in lower castes, but they deserve to be there because of their karma. And if you help them, you're just going to put them right back to where they got off the wheel of samsara on next time. Shocking. And then, of course, we know from our own American history, this idea of God on our side, manifest destiny, it's God's will that we rule from sea to shining sea. Many Native Americans were simply seen like animals, and they were hunted off the land just like you would hunt a grizzly bear or wolves, and you would want to drive them out, not considering them human, not considering them God bearers. And this is a problem, right? Racism, greed, selfishness, misogyny, fear, xenophobia, they occur in all these worldviews. They just come up with different justifications for them. Naturalists, materialists are using science or this idea of eugenics. theists are using this, it's God's will, God wills it, and pantheism, it's everyone gets what they deserve in the wheel of karma. Any comments on any of this? I think I had one more picture for you. I already shared that one. Okay, well, let's do the conclusion of the matter then. So I've given you that pie where we had animism in the middle, polytheism, and then out of that we either got theism, pantheism, or naturalism, materialism. And so we've gone around the circle. We've looked at these different worldviews and how they relate to origins. I think the strengths of the naturalist materialist position are the strengths of science that Eugenie Scott pointed out, that you don't have to have some avatar talk to you or the Holy Spirit or read it in some sacred book. But regardless of your worldview or perspective, we can all come and we can look at the same empirical data or evidence, and we can run experiments, and we can check our biases or presuppositions at the door. We can create a hypothesis, and we can test it, and we can see what can happen. And that is the beauty about science, is it's asking you to come directly and look at what's happening and test and come up with ideas, and then to be willing to change your conclusions as more testing or more data or evidence comes in. And I think this is really important, especially with, I'm sure you've been seeing all the different conspiracy videos and anti-conspiracy videos being batted back and forth during this coronavirus thing. When you start pontificating science like a dogma, like we just have to believe the scientist or something like that, you've turned science into almost like a religion. A scientist is supposed to stay in this fluid, flexible place, and they should always be qualifying stuff like, to the best of our knowledge, the current data shows, and you'll see the difference when you hear what I would consider legit scientists talking. Now, I may disagree with their presuppositions or even conclusions, but they're at least qualifying that stuff like, on the data collected, on what we know at this point, based on these assessments, this is what we're understanding. They're not bringing down these things like evolution is a fact, or, I mean, the Big Bang was a fact. I mean, they may be strong theories with lots of supportive inferences, and maybe some things we can observe today that we could then infer back into time. I'm perfectly fine with that. But whether you're a creationist, a pantheist, or a naturalist materialist, part of being a critical thinker is being aware of your worldview, of your biases, of your presuppositions. And I hope this has really helped you see how this works. And I think it will really help you in your encounters with other people. If you can kind of get a beat, and this isn't to judge people or condemn them, but if you can at least see where someone's standing, you can get an idea of the perspective that they're going to see. And what I try to do for you in this class is to allow you to stand in different parts of the circle and look at the same thing and let you see it from different perspectives. I personally think the more perspective you can get, better. This is why I believe God is omniscient, is objective, or has absolute truth, because God, it's not just because of his perspective, it's his very nature, but God has all perspective all the time. Everything. There is no perspective God does not have. He knows every angle, every point of view, every mitigating circumstance from the inside and out. Whereas we as humans have very limited perspective. I mean, even modern science, think how little, what, the last 160 years or so, 200 years, if you want to go back 300-400 years to 16th, 17th century with Francis Bacon, 400 years compared to 14 billion years. I mean, if you took a string and tried to mark off what 400 would be on a 14 billion long string, it would be almost imperceptible. And yet we're inferring from our limited window of observation it back into billions and billions of years. All right. Well, I hope this was a blessing to you. I hope you use this information for good and for engaging and creating dialogue, not arguing or trying to shut people down. And I'm here for you as a resource, and I love this stuff. I love to talk about it, and I hope it serves you well. Take care. All right.